Well, anyway, a little bit about myself. My name is Whitten. I'm originally from Baltimore. I got radically saved in 1996. It used to be a Grateful Dead head. For those that knew who they were a 60s band. Somehow we're still alive. When I graduated high school in 1989, that means I'm only 44. I know I have all white hair. My wife says to me yesterday, you got to tell everyone that you're 44 because people think that I'm robbing the cradle. That's what she says to me yesterday. I said, okay, I'll make sure I mention that. Anyway, they had a song called Touch of Gray. I've always had a little bit of white hair. My hair turned completely white. It kind of happened at the same time, either when I got married or when I moved to Israel. So I'm not sure if it's because I moved to Israel or because I got married. Or maybe it's a combination of both. I'm not sure. But I am a young guy, and I got radically saved in 1996. And then the Lord showed me that I was supposed to move to Israel. But I didn't know how I was going to get there. And then the Lord showed me I needed to start a website. Back in 1998, there was no one that had internet. I mean, very few people had, email addresses. And now look how it's overwhelmed everything. Very early on, the Lord showed me that the key to revival, we're all praying for revival. We're saying, Lord, send revival, send revival. But I believe one of the reasons why we don't have revival is because we haven't made the key ingredient to revival is the Jewish revival. This is what it says in Romans 11. It says, I say then, did they stumble? Talking about the Jewish people. Did they stumble that they might fall? God forbid, but by their fall, salvation has come to the Gentiles to provoke them to jealousy. So here it is. We're supposed to provoke the Jewish people to jealousy. How do you provoke someone to jealousy? Is it to hate them? Is it to tell them that the reality is to provoke them jealousy is to love them as Yeshua loved them? That means to love them unconditionally. And then it continues on. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. I meant to do this. Now notice this. This is key. Now, if their fall is riches for the world. Now, if the Jewish people's rejection of the Messiah in the first century, and what is the rejection of Messiah brought to the Gentiles? It's brought us riches. What are the riches it's talking about? The riches of salvation. What's the profit of man if he gains the entire world and loses his own soul? What shall a man give in exchange for a soul? So salvation is more than this whole world could ever give us. And they said this, and here's what Paul says. Now, if they rejected the Messiah, that we could walk in this thing called salvation, then it says this, and their loss is riches for the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? So the rhetorical question that Paul asks is, what happens when they do believe that Yeshua is their Messiah? You see, Charles Spurgeon wrote this in the 1800s. He says, I do not think that we attach enough importance to the restoration of the Jews. To those that were the first apostles to us who are far off, the first missionaries to us who are far off, for they shall be regathered in again. And then he said this, until that shall be, the church's glory can never come. Matchless benefits are tied to the spiritual restoration of Israel, for the regathering is life from the dead. And so we are making this connection. Most people are praying for revival. We know we need revival, but we're not praying for the salvation of Israel. See, what's happening is there's a lot of ministries on TV that go ahead and say, we need to bless Israel, we need to bless Israel. But how often do the same ministries talk about need to bless Israel? They talk about we need to pray for their salvation. We just had the Pope come out yesterday saying the Jewish people, we don't need to go ahead and show them that Yeshua is their Messiah. That is heresy. Everyone needs the Messiah. Yeshua went to the lost house of Israel first. If they didn't need the Messiah, he shouldn't have gone to them. That's where the ministry started. And now all of a sudden the Pope says, no, they don't need the Messiah. Yes, they do. Everyone needs the Messiah. Now, I want to take you back to when the Gentiles came into the kingdom. Peter has a vision. In this vision, there's clean and unclean animals. And he says to the Lord, look, I've never had anything unclean. And so they have a very interesting thing happen in the first century. There's a bunch of Jewish people got together. And they asked themselves, what do we do with these Gentiles that believe? The irony is now we're on the opposite side of the spectrum. And the opposite side of the spectrum is this, that we got a bunch of Gentiles saying, what do we do with these Jews that believe? You see, we're just on the opposite side of the paradigm. And so here's what happens. James stands up, or Yaakov stands up, and he preaches this, and he says, in that day I will raise up the tabernacle of David, which has fallen down, and repair its damages. I will raise it up on its ruins, and rebuild it as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom, and all the Gentiles who are called by my name, declares the Lord who does this. This is what he quotes. But this is not where the passage ends. It's actually being fulfilled in our day. And we're going to go to verse 14. It says, I will bring back the captives of my people Israel. The Jewish people were in Jerusalem when James was preaching this word. This doesn't happen to our day. So the prophecy is actually being fulfilled in our day. And then it says this, they shall rebuild the waste cities and inhabit them. The city I live in is a city called Arad. Now, if you forget it, we're between a rod and a hard place. We are 20 minutes from the Dead Sea. It is the city where the spies first spied out the land before the land was conquested. In Arad, there is an ancient high place that still remains to this day. Now, you'll remember in the Bible, God always said to the kings, destroy the high places. Why? Because they were mixing the profane and the holy. Well, during the time of Josiah, 2 kings prior, Hezekiah had actually buried the high place in Arad. So when Josiah came on the scenes, there was no high place to destroy because he couldn't see it. But later on, the Romans were making the spice trail from Saudi Arabia, going from India, Saudi Arabia, coming across the Negev, and they unburied the high place of Arad. And to this day, you can actually go there, you can actually see an ancient Israelite temple. And there's an altar there. They have a replica of the Ten Commandments. The actual replica of the Ten Commandments is actually on display in the Israel Museum. It is a high place that God called an abomination because they were mixing the holy and the profane. Now, outside of our town, if you come in, you'll see these huge snakes and these huge, eagles, or actually more like vultures, on these totem poles. And there is a spiritual stronghold over our town. This is a town where a certain sect of Orthodox Judaism called the Ger Hasidim, they believe that anyone that doesn't believe like they do is an apostate. So that not only have they started riots with us, they started riots with the conservative Jews in the town because they're not Jewish enough for them. And so we've had protests outside of our house. We've had ministry centers firebombed. We've had Brit Hadashahs, which is New Testaments, torn up and thrown in our yards. We've had protests outside of our house. You name it, we've almost had it. It has been absolutely insane for the last 8 years that we've been there. But this city was not rebuilt until 1963. It wasn't rebuilt until 1963. And here's what it says. They shall rebuild the waste cities and inhabit them. And then it says, they shall plant vineyards and drink their wine. Outside of Arad, there is a vineyard. Strangely enough, they decided to make a vineyard in the Negev desert. What they figured out is that if grapevines get a lot of water, they get very big grapes, and you get a lot of wine. But it's not nearly as potent and not nearly as smooth. What they figured out is that if you actually deprive grapevines of water, you have smaller grapes, and so that it's smoother with a lot more kick, if you know what I mean. This bottle of wine, they literally sell bottles of wine. It's over $100 a bottle. This is prophecy being fulfilled. They shall make gardens and eat their fruit. I will plant them in their land, and they shall never again be uprooted from the land that I've given them, says the Lord your God. For those that think that Israel will be wiped off in 2 years, as it was just mentioned, one of the terrorists in San Bernardino, one of the terrorists, the father said, don't worry about Israel. It's going to be wiped off in 2 years. I'm sorry, it's not. Okay? But now, buried in the middle of this passage is verse 13. Now look at this. It says this, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes of him who sows the seed. The mountains shall drip with sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it. Buried inside the verse 13 of the 5 verses, verse 3, is focused on the harvest. And it's talking about a time when the harvest is so great, the person that's sowing is reaping what he just sowed. It's so abundant they can't understand the harvest. We're living in a day and an age where people don't understand that we are in the harvest of the world. We can get so focused on the tares, all the evils of the world, and forget that the wheat is growing up with the tares. Now, this happens to be a human population growth chart. And if you watch this closely, you'll see that for the first 1,800 years, I can show it on this one. So for the first 1,800 years, it is basically flat. Anyone that sows anything into the ground like corn or any agricultural product, it basically doesn't grow. And you're wondering, when is the thing ever going to grow? And then all of a sudden, it pops its little head up. In about 1880, we got to our first billion people. In 1930, we got to our second billion people. And now, not even 100 years later, we're at 7.5 billion people, right about here. If the Lord decides to tarry another 10 years, we may get to 10 billion people. But if you noticed, it went straight up. What people don't understand is there's more people alive today than all 2,000 years of world history combined. You have to understand that even if a remnant gets saved today, the remnant that gets saved today will be more than everyone that got saved for 2,000 years combined. So you're alive for the greatest harvest the world has ever seen. Now, to be part of this harvest and part of this world revival, you have to understand the key ingredient. The key ingredient is Israel. You have to start praying for the salvation of Israel. This is why we don't have revival, I believe. It's because we're not actively seeking the salvation of Israel, because their salvation is connected to our salvation in general. And their revival is connected to our revival. Our revival is connected to their revival. God did not make it separate. God is trying to intertwine the two. You have to understand it's all connected. Now, I do a site called Worthy News. Now, when I did this site, I basically started, I'm going to put this down for just a second. My mouth is getting a little dry. When I started Worthy News, the idea was to actually find only those things which are worthy. And it basically was, my goal was to find 7 stories a day. And now it's like the news is exploded. There's so many events that are happening. It's almost unreal how fast time is actually speeding up. Now, when I left the States last year, gay marriage was not passed by the Supreme Court. A little background about myself. I used to work at the Christian Coalition. I left the Christian Coalition in 2003. We weren't even discussing gay marriage in 2003 when I moved to Israel. That's how fast everything's taking place. And now we have the gay marriage passed. But I don't want to focus on that. I want to focus on the Iranian deal. Because the Iranian deal is basically going to send us right into World War III. Now, we all know what ISIS has done. ISIS, when they captured the bank in Mosul, they basically became the richest terrorist organization overnight when they had $2 billion. This Iranian deal, this nuclear deal, will give Iran $150 billion. Think about what ISIS did with $2 billion. Now we're getting ready to give a state that's calling for the death to America and death to Israel $150 billion. The problem is we hear this amount of money all the time. We can't put it in perspective. So this is a perspective. Since 1948, the entire U.S. aid given to Israel for over 70 years only totals $124 billion. They're going to receive in a few months more money than we've given to Israel for over 70 years. Now, also inside this deal is a clause that was put in the last moment. I want to show it right here. This was put in. Article 10 was added to the last in the agreement at the last moment. What it says is this. Whoops. It's all threats of sabotage. That all those that sign the deal are called to protect Iran against all threats of sabotage. Well, over the years, we've had a situation where, we've had viruses take down different Iranian computer systems. We've had nuclear scientists that have died. We've had all kinds of different. And now what happens if Israel decides that the Iranian nuclear program is too far advanced and they go to destroy it? We wonder how Zechariah 14 can be fulfilled when it says, all nations shall come against Israel. And now this agreement is actually forcing the United States the U.S. will have to protect Iran's nuclear facilities. It's a bizarre world that we live in. Now, we just came out just 2 weeks ago, the IAEA, which is the International Atomic Energy Agency, came out with a report saying that Iran's been working on a military bomb. We just found out, and We just made an agreement with a program that's trying to make the bomb. They just tested another nuclear ballistic missile. They don't care what we think. They're going to do whatever they want. If they really cared what we thought, they wouldn't be test firing ballistic missiles. But the West is so weak that we're revisiting World War II and what brought forth World War II, when Chamberlain was weak with Hitler. And now we have the situation, but I want to actually focus on a little bit of hope. We can so focus on how we live in the midst of Sodom and Gomorrah that there's still hope. Now, this is a very interesting picture. This is September 10th, the day before 9/11. You see there's a rainbow here, and it's actually another rainbow here. It's actually a double rainbow. And a lot of people say, well, there's no hope for America. Yes, there's still hope. God said if he found just 10 righteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah, he would not have destroyed it. I see more than 10 righteous people in this room. You have to understand that God still has a plan here. Now, I want to take you to September 11th. September 11th in Israel, I was sitting outside my house, and I kid you not, it was the most fantastic display of lightning I have ever seen. It put the 4th of July fireworks to shame. It went on for over 30 minutes. Well, this was what was happening in Saudi Arabia. This is the Grand Mosque, basically the symbol of power of Saudi Arabia. And this lightning storm goes on, and it actually strikes a crane. When it strikes the crane, it actually comes down and kills an Iranian scientist. Over 100 people died, but I find it interesting that an Iranian scientist died in this. Now, when this crane got struck, it happened just before the 6 o'clock prayers in Saudi Arabia, which would make it just before 10 o'clock in New York time. 14 years to the day, the first tower fell in 952. 14 of the 18 terrorists were Saudis. It happened almost to the minute, 14 years later. Now, what was more interesting was that the crane was actually owned by the bin Laden family. It was owned by the bin Laden family, who was contracted to rebuild the Grand Mosque. And all of a sudden, the people were saying, well, this is an act of God. And what they were saying was that the reason why Allah has struck is because the Saudi monarchy is in apostasy. When King Abdullah died about 8 months ago or so, when he died, the whole monarchy is in disarray. And according to Shiite, there's two main branches of Islam in Israel, Sunni and Shiite. Sunni is Saudi Arabia, Shiite is Iran. And according to Iranian hadiths, which are Islamic commentaries, they're expecting someone named Abdullah to die. And when he dies, that there will be an uprising in Yemen. Now we have a civil war in Yemen. And from Yemen, a guy named the Mahdi, or the Islamic Messiah, is going to rise up and retake Mecca and Medina. So the Sunnis are trying all they can do to try to prevent this from taking place. And just a few days later, there was a whole stampede, and all of a sudden Iran saying, you're responsible for all this. And so Saudi Arabia went ahead and beheaded 28 of their own officials, who they said was responsible for the stampede. It wasn't so much that this was what I found interesting. What I found more interesting was just a week prior, they were chosen to head the UN Human Rights Panel. The Human Rights Panel is being headed by Saudi Arabia, who just beheaded 28 of their own officials. We live in such a backwards world. Now, I want to jump to what happened in the Shemitah. The Shemitah is once every 7 years, the land is called to rest, and basically there's a lot of writing about the global markets. And people said, well, nothing happened during the Shemitah. Well, that's not exactly accurate, because there were so many events happening outside of the U.S. that people weren't aware. This is what Bloomberg says, that $11 trillion was wiped out of the world markets. $11 trillion. Now, the problem is that we hear the word trillion so much, we don't understand how much it is. So let me give it to you in the space of time. 1 million seconds is about 13 days. A billion seconds is about 31 years. 1 trillion seconds is about 31,000 years. Okay, so let me give it to you in a little bit of. So this is $1 million in $100 bills. Okay, this is $100 million in $100 bills. This is a woman, probably 5'5", sitting on a couch made of $100 bills. Now this is $1 billion. This is a man standing next to a couple pallets. Okay, this is $1 trillion. This is the same woman and the same man. That is the White House. That is an 18-wheeler. That's a 747. When we hear that the United States is spending $1 trillion more than it has, that's a lot of money. When you hear that the markets lose $11 trillion, that's a lot of money. That's what took place during the Shemitah. Now, on the same day, on the Shemitah, what happened was Israel finds out that inside of the Dome of the Rock and inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, they have pipe bombs. They have weapons. They're getting ready to kill Jewish people as they go up to the Temple Mount to pray for Rosh Hashanah. For Rosh Hashanah, for those who don't know, it's the Jewish New Year. So there are going to be Jews going up to the Temple Mount to pray. And so Israel finds out they're going to try to cause a terrorist action on the Temple Mount. So Israel goes into the Dome of the Rock and goes into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. When they do this, Hamas and Fatah have called this a declaration of war. All the terrorist attacks that have been going on for over 2 months is stemmed from this event right here. 3 days after this event, there was constant rioting. This is actually some pictures inside. You'll see that this happened September 13th, just hours before Rosh Hashanah. This is a guy wearing a Hamas headband, for those that don't know. The events that are happening inside of Israel today are based off of this main event. Right outside my father-in-law's house, he lives right by the Shuk, which is the main marketplace in Jerusalem. It's called Makne Yehuda. There was just last week 2 Palestinian girls, 15 years old, that took a pair of scissors and stabbed a man that was 7 years old. They thought he was Jewish. He actually wound up being another Palestinian man. There's so many events that are taking place. It's happening so frequently. What Paris saw, Israel's been dealing with for years. Now, I'm going to jump to September 25th. September 25th, the Pope comes to the U.S. to speak first before Congress. The next day, John Boehner resigns. The following day, here he is. He's speaking at the UN. And he's at the UN, and he's pushing forward Agenda 21, which is the globalization of the world. They want to have everything finished by 2030, you'll see right here. And this program to implement will cost between $3 and $5 billion a year. Now, the following day, or actually just a few days later, we had the blood red moon. And so a lot of people were expecting, we're going to expect something on the blood red moon. And what they're not connecting is the fact that Russia struck Syria the day after the blood red moon. And when they struck Syria, it actually started this whole thing, because now there's 14 countries flying inside of Syria, which is the size of Washington State. Just last week, we had a situation where that Turkey shoots down a Russian jet. When they shoot down a Russian jet, people forget that Turkey is a member of NATO. And Article 5 of NATO says this: a military action against one member of NATO is like a military action against all of NATO. If Russia would have responded, we would have had World War III 2 weeks ago. How many knew that? So now you have a situation. Now this is the most revealing event this week. Putin says, I hope we don't need to nuke ISIS. We have a situation that prophecy has yet been fulfilled in Isaiah 17, where it talks about Damascus being a ruinous heap. We are now sitting in the stages for prophecy being fulfilled. But I want to focus on our hope. We can see all the tares. We can see all the tares, and we can see all the evils of the world, and it would be very easy for us to get into a doom and gloom mode. But the reality is that we're alive for such a time as this. And what I love is that Paul writes, I'm jumping the gun. I'm going to finish this portion up real quick. Most people don't realize that we're also working toward globalization on a major scale. This is called the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's the TPP. It was negotiated behind closed doors. It will unify basically all the Asian countries. It will unify about 40% of the world economies. Just 2 weeks ago, Obama said, well, just read it. It's double the size of Obamacare. It's over 100 pounds big. Okay, now this will globalize about 30% of the world economies. And then also at the same time, the EU and the U.S. have had negotiations behind closed doors. They just had their 11th closed door agreement, the 11th round of closed round talks. And this will incorporate 50% or so of the global economy. By the time the TPP and the TPIP are finished in 2016, 80% of the world economies will be unified. How many realize we're going full-fledged right into globalization? This is happening right now, and we're not even hearing this on the news. Now, I want to get back to what we're supposed to do in this day, in this age. We can get so caught up in the doom and gloom and get so caught up that we forget our responsibility. And what I love about Paul is that he actually writes this, and this is what he says, that all these things happen to them as examples, and they're written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. He says, look, do you realize that you're in the last days? We're in the last days, and he writes this for our admonition. He says, look, study this out. What does he say to study out? Well, he's actually studying out the Exodus, because this is how it starts. It says, moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware. So he says, wake up. Be aware that all of our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food. They all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock which followed them. That rock was Mashiach. Now look at verse 5. But with most of them, God was not well pleased. It's very interesting that Paul goes ahead and says, look, if you want to study the last days, you actually have to study Exodus. Because in Exodus, you're going to find a lot of the things that in Exodus are actually re-happening to us in the last days. If you study out Revelation, for example, you'll realize there's two witnesses. Well, in Exodus, you had two witnesses, Moses and Aaron. You realize that the false beast and the false prophet are going to be doing signs and wonders. We realize in the Exodus that you had Pharaoh and his magicians doing the same wonders. You start seeing the same plagues. Water turned to blood, frogs, boils, hail, the same plagues. In Revelation, it talks about over and over again, 42 months. Well, the children of Israel stopped 42 times in the Exodus journey. If you study the two, it's amazing how they compare. But now I want to focus on verse 5. It says, now with most of them, God was not well pleased. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now, this is not talking about salvation. We know that Moses is saved. He didn't go into the promised land. But I want to talk about what is God expecting from us? If in order for us to go into the full promises of God, we need to study the Exodus. And here's what it says in verse 6. Now these things became our examples to the intent, ready, first one, that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. Verse 7, do not become idolaters as some of them, as is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Verse 8, nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and one day 23,000 fell. Verse 9, nor let us tempt Christ, nor let us tempt Mashiach, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now verse 10 is the one that slapped me up across the face. Nor complain, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. We can look around, and there's a lot to complain about. I mean, we live in a world that, it is so upside down, inside out. And the Lord basically told me, stop complaining, start doing something about it. And then verse 11, now all these things happened to them as examples, and they're written for our admonition, that upon whom the ends of the ages have come. This was written for us to study out, because inside the Exodus account is how we're supposed to live. We're not supposed to make the same mistakes as the Israelites made. Now, I believe there's two voices speaking to the body right now. The two voices, and I'm going to go back to the Exodus account. I want to focus on the spies that went out. It says this. Then Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan and said to them, go up this way into, actually in the Hebrew says the Negev, into the south, and go up to the mountains and see what the land is like, whether the people who dwell in it are strong or weak, few or many, whether the land they dwell in is good or bad, or whether the cities they inhabit are like camps or strongholds, whether the land is rich or poor, whether there are forests or not. Be of good courage and bring some of the fruit of the land. Now the time was the season of the first ripe grapes. The season the spies spraying out the spied land was the season of the harvest. I hope I've explained to you that we are now in the harvest of the world. We're going to see more people saved in our generation than all 2,000 years combined. We're in the harvest of the world. The voices that went out to spy out the land, it was in the time of the harvest. And then here's what happens. Now they departed and came back to Moshe and Aaron and to all the congregation of the children of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them, and all the congregation showed them the fruit of the land. Then they told him and said, we went to the land where he sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Now notice this, verse 28. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. who are not, well, it continues on, but the men who had gone up with him said, we are not able to go against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they gave the children of Israel a bad report of the land, saying, which we spied out, saying, the land which we have gone in as spies is a land ready that devours its inhabitants. And all the people we saw in it were men of great stature. There we saw the giants. The descendants of Anak come from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. It's a very interesting passage. It talks about them saying, we can't go up because the land is full of fortified cities. It says the people are giants in the land. We can look around like the 10 spies, and we can be so focused on the circumstances around us. We have a city, Las Vegas, where, it's Sin City. We have New York City. We have Miami. We have all these cities that we would consider Sodom and Gomorrah. We would say these are fortified cities. We have spiritual giants in the land. We have sin like we've never seen before. And we can say we can't do anything. We can't take the land. I live in Israel. There's 15,000 or so Jewish believers in Israel. And my Bible tells me that all of Israel shall be saved. If I adopted this attitude, of course nothing would take place. No revival would ever take place. They had to understand who they were. See, the problem was they were looking at themselves in the light of everyone else, and they were looking at themselves as grasshoppers. They didn't have God's perspective of who they were. See, now there's something different, because now we read about Caleb and Joshua, and it says this, then Caleb quieted the people before Moshe and said, let us go up once and take possession, for we are well able to overcome it. What was different about Caleb? Well, here's what it says in Numbers 24. But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit in him and has followed me fully. Caleb had a different spirit and has followed God fully. And guess what? He was able to walk into the promises of God. He wasn't mixing the profane and the holy. He was following God fully. And because he was following God fully, there's something different about him, because it continues on. They spoke to the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, the land which we passed through to spy is exceedingly good land. How many know that the harvest is the greatest it's ever been now? We have an exceedingly abundant harvest, that God has allowed us to be harvesters in this greatest harvest the world has ever seen. If the Lord delights in us. There's the word if. We got to get holy, people. We got to get righteous, people. Paul already gives us the examples. He says, look, flee sexual immorality, flee idolatry, flee all these things. He says, don't complain. What he's saying is, look, you got to get holy. If you will get holy, if the Lord delights in us, he will bring us to the land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Now, verse 9, only do not rebel against the Lord. What's rebellion against the Lord? It's doing contrary to what he wants. His word, he sent the Mashiach so we would preach the gospel of the kingdom to all nations. That is what our duty is. People ask me all the time, I don't know what God's will is for my life. It's very simple. Share the good news. It's really that simple. We make it too complicated. And then it says this, nor fear the people of the land, for they are bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. See, what was different about Joshua and Caleb is they had the God factor involved. The 10 spies said, we're grasshoppers in the sight. And what Joshua and Caleb says, no, you don't understand. God is with us. If God is with us, who can be against us? They had the proper perspective of who they are. You have to have a proper perspective of who you are. You're called part of a royal priesthood. You're kings and priests of the Most High God. You're a peculiar people. It's okay. We're a peculiar bunch. I got all white hair. I'm 44. And they had the God factor. They said, if God is for us, who can be against us? They were getting ready to slay the giants of the land. They were getting ready to take the fortified cities. And they knew that the victory was theirs because it wasn't their victory. It was God's victory. Now look what happened. And all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Believe you me, if you start standing for the truth, as God talks about standing for the truth, of course the people will want to stone you. They've tried to stone Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb was telling them what to do. And they said, no, we don't believe you. Because we're not trusting what God says. And then look at this. Now the glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle of the meeting before all the children of Israel. God showed up. God showed up for Joshua and Caleb. And then it continues on and says, then the Lord said to Moshe, how long will these people reject me? And how long will they not believe me with all the signs which I have performed among them? We live in a day and an age where prophecy is being fulfilled before our very eyes. We see the reestablishment of Israel after 2,000 years, prophecy being fulfilled before our eyes. If we want to walk into the promises of God, we got to believe the promises of God for us. The greatest giant slayer, David. I want you to focus this, all right? The congregation was ready to stone Joshua and Caleb. It was no different for David when he was getting ready to slay Goliath. Now, Eliab, his older brother, heard when he had spoken to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David and said, why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and your insolence of heart, for you've come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Is there not a cause? David's own brother was trying to prevent him from slaying Goliath. Don't think that if you start standing for what the Lord says, you're going to even get opposition from within the body of Messiah. And then it continues on. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, whom the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. David wasn't coming at him with his own strength. He wasn't coming at him with anything that he was. He was coming at him in the name of the Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He was coming to him. Now notice this, ready? Verse 46, this day the Lord will deliver into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. What did David come to Goliath with? A slingshot. How was he going to take his head off? Basically, he was saying, I'm going to go ahead and kill you. After I kill you, I'm going to take your sword from you, and then I'm going to cut your head off. That's chutzpah, people. That's chutzpah. We have to get some holy chutzpah going on. I mean, not only is he saying, look, I'm going to take your head from you. He's standing there saying, I'm going to take your head from you. And God's saying, with what? What are you coming with me? The name of your God? Are you kidding me? Of course, Goliath was laughing. But notice, he doesn't even stop there because he continues on. This day the Lord will deliver into my hand. I will strike and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines. David was not just prepared to kill Goliath. He was getting ready to destroy the entire army of the Philistines by himself. People forget that in this message, that David was getting ready to defy all of the Philistines by himself. How could he do it? How could he have that holy chutzpah? Because he knew it wasn't his battle. It was God's battle. He just believed God. God had shown him his faithfulness. God had shown him who he was. And then it says that all the earth may know that there's a God in Israel. The reason why God brought the Philistines and God brought the darkness was to show that the God of Israel still reigns and rules on the throne. Continues on. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with the sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give it into our hands. So it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hastened and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. He was running toward the entire army by himself. That's holy chutzpah. That's chutzpah that we need in this day, in this hour. We have to understand who we are. We're kings and priests of the Most High God. We are not grasshoppers. This world looks around us and it's got spiritual fortresses. It's got giants that need to come down. We just got to get some holy chutzpah and realize that it's not our battle. It's God's battle. Now I want to take you back to 1967. Who was alive in 1967? I just want to see who was older than I was, that's all. 1967, very interesting year. Is the era of the age of Aquarius. It was false love, false peace. In the middle of San Francisco, Israel retakes Jerusalem. And there's a revival that breaks out on Ashbury and Haight. Now, the intersection of Asbury and Hay is very, very instrumental in my life because that's the intersection of the Grateful Dead. It was the intersection of basically the most, probably the most paganistic part of U.S. society in 1967. It was San Francisco. It was in the middle of San Francisco, in the middle of the age of Aquarius, that the Jesus movement started. And it went from 67 to 74, and there were more Jewish people that came to faith in those 7 years than all 2,000 years combined. It happened in the midst of Sodom and Gomorrah. We have to believe that God has placed us alive for such a time as this. It is not a time to cower back in fear. It is a time to recognize that God has promises for us, that God has called us to walk in His holiness and His righteousness. Why? Because He has a purpose. His purpose is to bring forth revival, to bring forth the greatest harvest this world has ever seen, and you're connected to it. You have to understand you're a part of this whole thing. And if you start walking like this, arise and shine, for your light has come. The glory of the Lord is risen upon you. For behold, the darkness shall cover the earth, and deep darkness the people. That is where we are right now. But the promise is to us, but the Lord will arise over you, and His glory will be seen upon you. That is our promise. Let us start walking in holiness and righteousness. Let us start walking as God called us to walk. As kings and priests of the Most High God, let's realize the job that we have in front of us is to bring forth revival. It is to start to go ahead and go forth with some chutzpah. Because it is not the end of the world for us. It is the beginning of the kingdom. So, Abba, Father, I ask you, Lord, that you would seal this word, Father. I ask you, Father, that you would place in the hearts of every person here some holy chutzpah. Father, to go forth in power and in might with the anointing of your Spirit, to go forth, to pull down the spiritual strongholds, to pull down the fortified cities, to slay the giants that are around us, that all the world would know that you still sit on the throne, that you still are in control. We praise you, Abba, in the midst of all evil, Father, that you're allowing your light to rise up through us. Help us to walk in your light. B'Shem Yeshua HaMashiach. Amen. I don't know what